Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're going to step back in time, not to some fantastical kingdom, but to a world of real-life political intrigue and religious fervour so intense it changed the course of history. We'll be tiptoeing through the dusty corridors of 15th century Castile, a place of warring factions and uncertain loyalties, to meet a young princess named Isabella. She's a figure so monumental, so complex, that her story seems almost too dramatic to be true. One moment you'll find yourself marvelling at her pious devotion and strategic brilliance. The next, you'll be shuddering at the ruthless decisions that stained her legacy in blood. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can all feel a little less alone in the quiet dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a fly on the wall in Madrigal de las Altas Torres, a modest Castilian town surrounded by the vast golden plains of Spain. It's April 22nd, 1451, and the air is thick with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Inside a simple, brick castle, a child is being born. This isn't a grand affair, not with the fanfare you'd expect for a future queen. No, it's a quiet, almost overlooked event. A daughter, they say. Her name is Isabella. She's the second child of King Juan II of Castile and his second wife, Isabella of Portugal. At this very moment, she's barely a footnote in the grand story of the kingdom. Her older half-brother Enrique is the undisputed heir to the throne. Her older full brother Alfonso is a sickly but still viable spare. So you can relax for now because this tiny infant has a very long list of people ahead of her. The pressure is off. You're just a spectator to a minor royal birth. But as you look closer at the world around her, you realise this is no ordinary kingdom. Castile in the mid-15th century is a political powder keg. King Juan II is a weak, indecisive ruler, more interested in poetry and music than in the gritty business of governance. His court is a viper's nest of nobles and courtiers, all jockeying for power, whispering slanders and raising private armies. One of the most prominent figures, the one who truly runs the show, is the royal favourite and constable, Álvaro de Luna. He is a master puppeteer, but his arrogance and immense power have earned him countless enemies. The king's second wife, Isabella of Portugal, is a woman of immense pride and ambition, but her sanity is tenuous, and she will soon descend into a debilitating madness that will cast a dark shadow over the princess's childhood. It's all a bit of a mess, isn't it? Imagine being born into that family. It's like being a character in a bad soap opera where everyone secretly wants to poison each other. The mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that Isabella's childhood was anything but stable. In 1453, when she was just 2 years old, her father, King Juan II, finally succumbed to the constant pressure from his nobles and had his longtime favourite, Álvaro de Luna, executed. It was a shocking move, a public beheading in Valladolid that sent a clear message to all the courtiers. No one's position was secure. The king himself died just a few months later, leaving the throne to Isabella's half-brother, Enrique IV. The new king immediately sidelined his stepmother and her 2 young children, Isabella and Alfonso, banishing them to the castle of Arevalo. This wasn't a gentle retirement. It was a political manoeuvre to keep them out of sight and out of the mind. You're now a silent witness to a royal family's fracture, with a toddler princess being shuffled off to a remote and crumbling residence, her future uncertain. Historians still argue whether King Enrique's actions were born of genuine malice or simple political expediency. Was he trying to protect himself from potential rivals, or was he genuinely worried about the volatile temperament of his stepmother, the former queen? Whatever his motive, the result was the same. The children were raised in relative obscurity, away from the glittering, treacherous world of the royal court. This isolation, this lack of formal royal education, paradoxically shaped Isabella into the formidable woman she would become. She was forced to rely on her own wits, to observe the political chaos from a distance, and to develop a deep, unshakable faith that would be her guiding light, and, for many, her greatest flaw. This isolation also gives us a quirky tidbit about her early life. Isabella spent her childhood in a sort of humble piety that was extremely unusual for a royal princess. There were no lavish tutors or grand ceremonies. Instead, she was raised by a few ladies-in-waiting in a state of quiet religious observance. She learned to read and write, of course, but her true education came from the spiritual texts and the humble life she was forced to live. It was here, in the quiet solitude of Arevalo, that she developed a profound personal piety, a devotion to Catholicism that was not merely a matter of state, but a deeply felt, consuming passion. Imagine a future queen spending her days in prayer and needlepoint, her world small and contained while the great lords of the land squabbled and bled. It's almost quaint, isn't it? Except for the fact that this quiet, unassuming girl was quietly building the internal fortitude that would one day allow her to rule a unified Spain and sponsor the most significant voyage of discovery in human history. But back to the chaos. Enrique IV was known as the Impotent. Now, whether he actually was or not is, once again, something historians still argue over, but his inability to produce a legitimate heir was a major point of contention. His first marriage was annulled, and his second, to Joanna of Portugal, produced a daughter, Juana. The nobles, however, immediately began whispering that Juana was not his child, but rather the illegitimate daughter of a royal favourite, Beltrán de la Sueva. This scandal led to Juana being nicknamed La Beltraneja. It's a great piece of historical gossip, and it had a profound impact on Isabella's life. The legitimacy of the throne was in question, and a faction of powerful nobles desperate for a new candidate began to look at the quiet, pious princess in Arevalo. The wheels of a much bigger story are beginning to turn, and Isabella, who you've just watched being born and then tucked away, is now being slowly, inexorably pulled onto the main stage. The stage is set, the characters are in place, and the story of one of history's most contradictory figures is about to begin. You just get to sit back and watch it all unfold. The quiet of Arevalo is about to be shattered. You've seen the chessboard, and now the pieces are starting to move. After a childhood spent in the political shadows of Arevalo, you watch as the young Princess Isabella is called back to the court. It's no loving family reunion, it's a calculated move by King Enrique IV. With the nobles revolting and a civil war brewing over the succession, the king is forced to acknowledge his half-brother Alfonso as his heir in a desperate bid to calm the waters. The Treaty of the Bulls of Guisando in 1468 formalises this fragile truce. It seems like a peaceful solution, but you can feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface. It's like a forced family dinner where everyone is smiling, but secretly plotting to steal the good silverware. Alfonso, unfortunately, doesn't get to enjoy his new title for long. He dies suddenly and mysteriously in 1468. You can practically hear the conspiratorial whispers. Was it poison? Was it the plague? The fact is, he's gone, and now all eyes turn to Isabella. For the first time, you see the real Isabella emerge. She's no longer just the quiet, pious girl from Arevalo. She's a political force. The rebellious nobles, seeing her as their new champion, offer her the throne. But here's where Isabella shows her remarkable shrewdness. She refuses. Wait, what? She refuses? That's right. She knows that seizing the throne by force will only perpetuate the civil war, and forever brand her as a usurper. Instead, she opens negotiations with her half-brother, the king. She demands to be recognised as his official heir, not through rebellion, but through a formal agreement. This move is a stroke of genius. It's the difference between a bloody takeover and a legitimate transfer of power, and it's a mainstream historical fact that her refusal to seize the throne by force was a masterstroke that legitimised her claim in the eyes of many. This leads us to the Pact of the Bulls of Guisando, a renegotiation of the earlier treaty. In 1468, at a grand ceremony, King Enrique IV publicly declares Isabella his heir, sidelining his own daughter, Juana la Beltraneja. You can feel the palpable relief and the silent fury of those who supported Juana. The agreement comes with a catch. Isabella cannot marry without the king's consent. This is a crucial detail, a legal constraint designed to keep her within her brother's control. But if you've been paying attention to Isabella, you know she doesn't like to be controlled. The next thing you see is Isabella's political savvy in action. She knows her future is tied to a powerful alliance, and she has her sights set on Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Aragon. There's a bit of romantic intrigue here too, because they're actually second cousins, and they met once as children. So you can imagine a bit of a spark, a shared memory from a time before all this political mess. But the king, her brother, has other plans. He wants to marry her off to the aging King Afonso V of Portugal, a union that would secure a political alliance but would leave Isabella without true power. Isabella and Ferdinand, however, are not easily deterred. The historical record shows a fascinating and quirky tidbit. To bypass the King of Castile's disapproval and their own close kinship, they had to seek a papal dispensation. But getting the Pope's approval in a timely manner was tricky, so they resorted to a bit of a fabrication. A fake papal bull, or forged letter of approval from the Pope, was created to greenlight their marriage. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about their determination and willingness to bend the rules for political gain. It's a testament to the fact that even the most pious monarchs were not above a little creative paperwork to get what they wanted. So, in 1469, you're now a secret witness to their wedding. Isabella and Ferdinand meet in Valladolid. He has to travel in disguise, pretending to be a servant, a truly undignified entrance for a future king. The wedding is small and quiet, a far cry from the opulent ceremonies we associate with royalty. There are no fancy dresses or massive feasts. They are essentially eloping, defying her brother and setting off a chain reaction that will lead to another war. Remember how you thought her childhood was chaotic? It's about to get much, much worse. When King Enrique IV learns of the secret marriage, he is furious. He immediately revokes his recognition of Isabella as his heir, and once again declares his daughter, Juana la Beltraneja, the rightful successor. This sets the stage for the Castilian War of Succession. It's a brutal conflict, a civil war that pits Isabella's supporters against those who back Juana. The war rages for 5 years, and it's a true test of Isabella and Ferdinand's resolve. You'll see them crisscrossing the kingdom, rallying troops, raising funds, and negotiating with fractious nobles. But historians still argue whether Isabella and Ferdinand's marriage was primarily a political union, or if there was a genuine affection between them. While it was undeniably a strategic alliance, uniting the two major kingdoms of Spain, Castile and Aragon, their surviving letters and actions suggest a deep partnership and mutual respect. They ruled as a true team, a unique arrangement for the time. Ferdinand handled the military and foreign policy, while Isabella managed the internal affairs of Castile from finance to justice. This division of labour, this partnership of equals, was a revolutionary concept and a key factor in their success. You're watching them fight their way to the throne, not with brute force alone, but with a combination of military skill, political cunning, and a knack for PR. They present themselves as the rightful, God-anointed rulers, in stark contrast to the perceived illegitimacy of their rival, Juana. Isabella, in particular, cultivates an image of piety and virtue, a strategic counterpoint to the moral chaos of her brother's court. She is the embodiment of order and religious righteousness, a powerful symbol in a deeply Catholic kingdom. Finally, in 1479, after a long and draining war, King Enrique IV dies. Isabella is already in a position of strength, having won most of the key battles. Juana's supporters are defeated and the war is effectively over. The final treaty, the Treaty of Alcasovas, formally recognises Isabella as Queen of Castile. It's a moment of triumph, a culmination of a long, treacherous climb. You are there, standing in the crowd, watching a woman who was once a forgotten child in a remote castle ascend to the throne of a powerful kingdom. The crown fits. She's earned it, not through birthright alone, but through sheer will and political genius. She has gone from a quiet princess to a victorious queen, and her journey has just begun. The quiet little girl you met in the first section has now become a powerful monarch, and you can sense that her reign will be anything but quiet. The stage is now set for her to begin building the Spain she envisions, a task that will require even more ruthless choices. You've witnessed the improbable rise of Isabella to the throne of Castile. Now, you stand at her side, not just as a silent observer, but as a witness to the forging of a new nation. The year is 1479, and the Castilian War of Succession is over. The crown of Castile belongs to Isabella. But across the border, in the neighbouring kingdom of Aragon, her husband Ferdinand has just inherited his own throne. For the first time, the two most powerful Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula are ruled by a single, married couple. This is a monumental moment, a mainstream historical fact that lays the groundwork for what will eventually become the modern nation of Spain. It's not an immediate, seamless union, though. Their marriage, while a political triumph, is more of a personal union of crowns, not a complete merger of states. Castile and Aragon still retain their own laws, their own courts, and their own customs. It's like two businesses merging, but each company still has its own management team and its own corporate culture. The two monarchs, now known to history as the Catholic monarchs, set about consolidating their power and rebuilding their kingdoms after years of civil war. You get to see them in action, a truly dynamic duo. Ferdinand, a shrewd and pragmatic leader, focuses on foreign policy, securing alliances and expanding their influence. Isabella, with her strong will and pious nature, takes on the immense task of reforming Castile from the inside out. You can't help but be impressed by her energy. She's not just a figurehead, she's a hands-on ruler, crisscrossing the kingdom, holding court, and presiding over judicial proceedings. You watch her as she establishes a new royal council, staffed with educated jurists from the middle class rather than the often treacherous nobles. This is a brilliant move, a way to build a loyal bureaucracy that owes its power directly to the crown, not to the old aristocratic families. But governing two separate kingdoms under a single marriage is not a simple task. It requires constant negotiation, compromise, and a clear understanding of their respective roles. There's a quirky tidbit about their relationship that speaks to this. The motto they adopted, tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, which roughly translates to they amount to the same amount to them, Isabella as Ferdinand. This was more than just a catchy phrase. It was a formal declaration of their co-sovereignty, a statement that they were equal partners in every sense of the word. While Ferdinand was the king consort of Castile and Isabella the queen consort of Aragon, in practice their power was balanced and their decisions were joint. It's a remarkable example of power sharing for the time, especially in a world where patriarchal norms were so deeply ingrained. You see them seated side by side, signing documents together, their two signatures, Isabella and Ferdinand, forever intertwined on the pages of history. Now let's talk about the nobles. They haven't forgotten how to cause trouble. Remember how they were the ones who held so much power in Isabella's father's reign? Well, Isabella isn't about to let that happen again. She's ruthless in bringing them to heel. You watch as she establishes the Santa Hermandad, or Holy Brotherhood. This isn't a religious order, but a kind of police force, an armed civilian group responsible for maintaining law and order, particularly in the countryside where the nobles had a free hand. The Hermandad has the power to arrest criminals, impose sentences and punish wrongdoers. Its very existence is a direct challenge to the power of the old nobility, stripping them of their private armies and their ability to act with impunity. You can almost hear the grumbling from the great lords as they are forced to bow to the authority of the crown. It's a masterful move, a subtle and effective way to centralise power without resorting to a full-scale war. This is also when you see Isabella's religious convictions begin to take on a much more public and political dimension. She views her reign as a divine mission, a sacred trust from God to reform her kingdom and bring it into a state of purity. She is deeply concerned with the moral and religious state of her subjects. Her personal piety, which you saw develop in the quiet of Arevalo, now becomes a driving force for state policy. She champions the reform of the clergy, rooting out corruption and demanding a higher standard of behaviour from priests and bishops. It's a genuine attempt to purify the church from within, but it also serves a political purpose, making the church a more reliable ally of the crown. But historians still argue whether her religious fervour was a genuine personal belief or a shrewd political tool. Was her piety the true engine of her policies, or was it a convenient justification for consolidating power, centralising control and suppressing dissent? The answer, as you can probably guess, is a little of both. Her personal faith was undoubtedly real and deeply held, but she was also a brilliant politician who understood the power of religion to unite a nation and legitimise a monarch's rule. She used it to her full advantage, and speaking of unification, there's a big piece of the puzzle still missing. The southern part of the Iberian Peninsula is still a Muslim kingdom, the Emirate of Granada. For centuries, the Christian kingdoms of the north and the Muslim kingdom of the south have coexisted in a state of uneasy truce and sporadic warfare. But to Isabella and Ferdinand, the existence of a Muslim state on Spanish soil is an affront to their religious and political vision. They dream of a fully unified, fully Christian Iberian Peninsula. This is where their reign begins to take on a more aggressive and ultimately more violent character. The quiet work of internal reform is about to give way to a decade-long war of conquest, a final crusade to reclaim the last piece of what they considered their rightful land. The stage is being set, the armies are gathering, and you can feel the tension in the air. The unification of Spain is not just a matter of two crowns, but a matter of blood and faith. The peace you've just witnessed is temporary, and a much bigger conflict is just on the horizon. You've watched Isabella and Ferdinand consolidate their power, but now you're about to see them turn their attention outward to the last remaining piece of the puzzle, the Emirate of Granada. This is not a quick skirmish. It is a full-fledged 10-year-long war, a brutal and exhausting campaign that will define the early years of their reign. For the Catholic monarchs, this war isn't just about territorial conquest. It's a crusade, a holy mission to drive the last vestige of Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula. You can feel the righteousness in their crusade, the sense that they are fulfilling a divine prophecy. But you also know that for the people of Granada, this is a fight for their very survival, their culture, and their way of life. It's not just a war, it's a collision of worlds, a final stand. The war for Granada begins in 1482 and rages for a decade. It's a grinding, attritional conflict. The Castilian forces, organised and funded by Isabella's new centralised government, lay siege to one city after another. The war is a testament to Isabella's administrative genius. She's not just a queen, she's a master of logistics. You watch her at work ensuring that her troops are well fed, well armed, and well paid. This is a mainstream historical fact. Unlike many feudal conflicts which relied on the unreliable whims of noblemen, Isabella's army was a professional, disciplined force. She even established a mobile hospital unit to treat the wounded, a remarkably advanced idea for the time. This focus on the practical, on the nitty-gritty of war, is a testament to her pragmatism. She's a pious queen, yes, but she also understands that God helps those who help themselves. The war is a series of long, grueling sieges. The city of Ronda, built on a precipitous cliff, seems impregnable. You watch as the Castilian army surrounds it, their siege engines pounding at its ancient walls, but the Muslim defenders are resolute, and the war drags on. It's a story of small victories and agonising defeats. The most iconic moment of the campaign, and a great quirky tidbit, is the siege of the city of Baza in 1489. The siege lasted for 7 long months, and the Castilian army began to lose morale. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and demoralised. Isabella, ever the pragmatic leader, realised that the army needed a boost. So she packed up and moved her entire court. All the trappings of royalty, the gilded tents, the cooks, the servants, the ladies-in-waiting, right to the front lines. She sets up a temporary city, a miniature court right outside the besieged walls. Her presence, her simple act of being there, was enough to galvanise the troops. It's an incredible show of leadership, a queen literally getting her hands dirty to rally her forces. The sight of her, a powerful queen living in a tent city, was so powerful that it became a symbol of her unshakable resolve. The city of Baza, demoralised by her presence, surrendered soon after. You can sense the change in the air as the war winds down. The Castilian forces are relentless, and the last Muslim king of Granada, Boabdil, is in a precarious position. His own people are divided, and his kingdom is starving. The final siege of Granada begins in 1491. Isabella and Ferdinand, ever the showmen, build a new city, Santa Fe, right outside the walls of Granada. It's not just a camp, it's a permanent settlement, a symbol of their intention to stay until the city falls. This is their final ultimatum. The city of Granada, with its magnificent Alhambra palace, is a sight to behold. It's the last great bastion of Muslim civilization in Europe, a place of learning, art and poetry, but historians still argue about the terms of the final surrender. The Treaty of Granada, signed in November 1491, seems remarkably generous on paper. It promises the Muslim inhabitants, known as Moriscos, freedom of religion, the right to keep their property, and the protection of their customs. It seems like a peaceful and humane end to a long war. But you, as a close observer, can't shake the feeling that this is a temporary state of affairs. Was the treaty a genuine attempt at coexistence, or was it a tactical move to ensure a bloodless surrender with the intention of revoking its terms later? The truth, as you'll see, is that the terms will not be honoured and the peace will not last. the seemingly generous treaty will be torn up within a decade. Finally, on January 2nd, 1492, you watch the most symbolic moment of the entire campaign. King Boabdil, in a dramatic and mournful ceremony, hands over the keys to the city of Granada to Isabella and Ferdinand. It is said that as he rode away, he looked back at his lost kingdom and wept, earning the spot a lasting nickname, the Moor's Last Sigh. You can see Isabella's face etched with a mixture of triumph and piety. The long war is over. The dream of a unified Christian Spain is now a reality. The victory is celebrated throughout Europe. The Pope himself grants Isabella and Ferdinand the title of the Catholic monarchs, a title they will proudly carry for the rest of their lives. It is the perfect capstone to their years of struggle. But you know that this is not the end of the story. The peace has been secured, but the problem of religious diversity in their newly unified kingdom remains. The new Spain is not just Christian. It is also home to a large population of Jews and Muslims. The long, bloody war has solved one problem, but it has created another. What to do with the infidels who now live under their rule? The answer, you will soon see, is not as peaceful as the surrender of Granada seemed to promise. The seeds of a much more brutal and ideologically driven campaign are about to be sown, one that will not be fought on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the Spanish people. The war for territory is over, but the war for the soul of Spain has just begun. The victory in Granada feels like a celebration, a moment of triumph and divine favour. But as you stand in the newly conquered city, you sense a change in the air, a sharpening of focus from external conquest to internal purity. Isabella and Ferdinand, now the Catholic monarchs, are not content with a kingdom that is merely politically unified. They want a kingdom that is religiously unified as well, and you, as our time-travelling observer, are about to witness the birth of one of history's most terrifying institutions, the Spanish Inquisition. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Spanish Inquisition was formally established in 1478, before the fall of Granada. But it was in the years following the conquest that its power and scope truly exploded. The initial goal of the Inquisition was to root out heresy, particularly among a group of people known as conversos. These were Jews who had converted to Catholicism, either by choice or under duress, to avoid persecution. For generations they had lived alongside old Christians, often rising to positions of power and influence in society. But a deep-seated suspicion lingered. Were their conversions genuine? Or were they secretly practicing their old faith in secret, a betrayal of their new one? The Catholic monarchs, driven by a combination of religious zeal and political expediency, decided to find out. They asked for and received a papal bull from Pope Sixtus IV, authorizing them to appoint inquisitors in their kingdoms. The first tribunal was established in Seville in 1480. You can feel the fear spreading through the city as the first inquisitors, men chosen for their unbending piety and lack of mercy, begin their work. They are not beholden to the local bishops or secular courts. They answer only to the crown. Their power is absolute, and their methods are brutal. The initial target of the Inquisition, as we said, was the conversos. You watch as a respected merchant or a brilliant doctor, a man who has lived and worked his whole life as a Christian, is suddenly arrested and thrown into a dungeon. He is accused not of a crime against the state, but of a crime against God. He is accused of Judaizing, of secretly observing Jewish rituals, of lighting Sabbath candles, of eating kosher food. The process is a total sham. The accused is not told the names of his accusers, and a confession, no matter how it's obtained, is the primary goal. Torture is often used, a terrifying practice that leaves no physical marks to protect the inquisitors from charges of abuse. And as a quirky tidbit, one of the most common signs of a Judaizing converso, according to the Inquisition, was a clean shirt on Saturday. This seemingly harmless act, a sign of personal hygiene, was interpreted as a secret observance of the Jewish Sabbath. It's a chilling example of how normal, everyday behaviours could be twisted into evidence of heresy. The atmosphere of terror is palpable. Neighbours turn on neighbours, driven by religious fanaticism or simply to settle old scores. The Inquisition encourages a culture of denunciation, promising leniency to those who confess and name others. The public spectacle of the auto da fe, the act of faith, becomes a regular occurrence. You watch from a distance as the condemned are paraded through the streets in San Benitos, special penitential garments, before being sentenced. Their crimes are often absurd, their punishments often gruesome. The lucky ones are sent to prison or have their property confiscated, The unlucky ones are burned at the stake, a terrifying public ritual meant to cleanse the soul and serve as a warning to others. Isabella and Ferdinand are unwavering in their support for the Inquisition. They see it as a necessary tool to purify their kingdom and ensure the spiritual health of their subjects. They appoint Tomás de Torquemada as the first Inquisitor General in 1483. He is a man of legendary piety and uncompromising zeal. He is the personification of the Inquisition's cruelty, a fanatic who believes he is doing God's work. Under his leadership, the Inquisition's reach expands throughout Castile and Aragon. Its power is unmatched, and its victims are countless. But historians still argue about the true motivations behind the Spanish Inquisition. Was it purely a religious institution, driven by a genuine desire to enforce Catholic orthodoxy? Or was it a political tool, a way for the crown to centralise power and seize the wealth of the conversos, who often came from the merchant and professional classes? The truth is, it was likely both. The crown gained immense wealth from the confiscation of property from the condemned. It also gained immense political power, as the Inquisition provided a way to bypass the traditional legal system and a check on the power of the nobles and the church itself. The Inquisition was a powerful tool in Isabella's grand project of nation-building, a way to forge a unified, religiously pure identity for her new kingdom. The Inquisition, you now understand, is not a separate historical event. It is a direct and logical extension of Isabella's worldview, which you've seen developing since her childhood in Arevalo. Her unshakable belief that she was doing God's will is the engine that drives this terrifying machine. She sees no contradiction between her deep piety and the brutal methods of the Inquisition. In her mind, she is saving souls, even if it means destroying bodies. The Inquisition is the dark side of her project of unification, a shadow that will fall over the entire nation and stain her legacy for centuries to come. You have now witnessed the first of her great, terrible decisions, a choice that will set the stage for a period of intolerance and persecution that will forever change the face of Spain. The war is over, the kingdom is united, but now a new, more insidious battle is being waged, and this one is for the hearts and minds of her people, and you can't help but feel a chill. The dust is still settling from the conquest of Granada and the chilling start of the Inquisition, and you're now a witness to another defining moment in Isabella's reign. A moment that feels almost like a bizarre distraction from the serious business of state. Imagine you are in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand, and a strange, persistent man is trying to get an audience. His name is Christopher Columbus, and he is, to put it mildly, a bit of a pest. For years, he's been shopping around an audacious proposal to sail west across the Atlantic Ocean to reach the rich markets of the East. You see him, a gaunt, determined figure, with a wild gleam in his eye, arguing his case before sceptical courtiers. Most people think his plan is utterly insane. The conventional wisdom of the time, a mainstream historical fact, is that the Earth is a sphere, but they believe the journey across the unknown ocean would be impossibly long. The distance between Europe and Asia was thought to be far greater than Columbus calculated. The experts of the day, a council of learned men, including astronomers and cosmographers, listen to his pitch and dismiss it. They aren't just being closed-minded. They're using the best available scientific knowledge of the time to conclude that the voyage is not only foolhardy, but impossible. They tell him his math is wrong. And you know what? They were right. Columbus had drastically underestimated the circumference of the Earth, a quirky tidbit that most people forget. He thought Asia was about 2,400 miles away. In reality, it was closer to 10,000 miles away. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, he and his crew would have almost certainly perished at sea. Columbus, however, is a man of relentless conviction. He's been rejected by the King of Portugal, and now, after years of waiting, it seems the Spanish monarchs are also poised to turn him down. He's on the verge of giving up, of leaving Spain to try his luck with the King of France. But here's where Isabella steps in. She's a woman of immense piety, and she's also an ambitious queen. The long, expensive war for Granada has depleted the royal treasury, but her conquest of the last Muslim kingdom in Europe has left her with a soaring sense of confidence and a feeling of divine favour. She sees an opportunity, a way to bypass the Venetians and the Portuguese who dominate the existing trade routes to the east, and to bring new wealth and, more importantly, new souls for conversion to her kingdom. So, you watch as she makes a final, fateful decision. After a last-minute plea from Columbus's supporters, including a sympathetic royal confessor, she agrees to fund the expedition. The agreement is formalised in the Capitulations of Santa Fe in 1492. The terms are surprisingly generous for Columbus. He is to be made Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any new lands he discovers. He's also promised a tenth of all the wealth found in those lands. It's a huge gamble, a tiny investment with the potential for an unimaginable payoff. It's a moment that captures the essence of Isabella's reign, a combination of religious fervour, a bold willingness to take risks, and a desire for national glory. But historians still argue about the true motivations behind Isabella's decision to support Columbus. Was it a purely economic decision, a calculated risk to break the monopoly on the spice trade? Was it a religious one, a desire to spread Catholicism to new lands and find new resources for a future crusade to the Holy Land? Or was it something else, a personal conviction, a leap of faith born of her deep religious beliefs and her sense of divine mission? The truth is, it was likely all of these things. Isabella was not a gambler in the traditional sense, but she understood the power of a long shot. She saw something in Columbus's zeal that resonated with her own. He was a fanatic, but so was she. He believed in his mission with an unshakable faith, and so did she. In a way, they were two of a kind. And let's not forget the timing. The agreement is signed just a few months after the fall of Granada, and just a few months before Isabella makes another momentous and terrible decision. This is not a coincidence. The fall of Granada marks a turning point, a culmination of her dream of a unified Christian Spain. With her kingdom now secure, she can turn her attention to the world beyond its borders. The very same year, 1492, will see the beginning of a voyage that will change the course of human history, and it will also see an edict that will forever stain her reputation in the eyes of many. You are now a witness to the final preparations. 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, are being prepared in the port of Palos de la Frontera. They are tiny, flimsy vessels by modern standards, and the crew is a motley collection of sailors, adventurers, and criminals who were pardoned from prison to fill out the ranks. There is no guarantee of success, no certainty that they won't simply sail off the edge of the world. But for a queen who has gambled her future on a secretive marriage and a decade-long war, this seems like just another day at the office. The ships are ready, the crew is assembled, and the future of the world is about to be rewritten by a man who was almost a footnote and a queen who took a chance on him. The voyage, the next step, will be a leap into the complete unknown. You've witnessed the tense negotiations and the last-minute gamble that set the stage for this moment. Now you stand on the dusty docks of Palos de la Frontera, a small, bustling port city on the southern coast of Spain. It's early morning, August 3rd, 1492. The air is thick with the smell of salt, pine tar, and the nervous energy of the crews preparing to embark on an impossible journey. You watch as Christopher Columbus, now Admiral of the Ocean Sea, climbs aboard the Santa Maria, a small 2-masted carrack, little more than a bathtub with sails. The Niña and the Pinta, 2 even smaller caravels, bob beside her. The scale of this undertaking feels comically small. 3 tiny ships, no bigger than a modern fishing trawler, are about to set out into a vast unknown abyss. You can feel the mix of emotions among the crew. Fear, of course, but also a giddy sense of adventure and a genuine belief in the promise of riches and glory. For many of them, this voyage is a desperate last chance, a way to escape a life of poverty or to be pardoned from their crimes. They are not heroes in shining armour, they are sailors, and a few are pardoned criminals, a quirky tidbit that reminds you of how rough and ready this expedition really was. The ships are provisioned with hardtack, salted meat, wine, and a few live animals. The technology on board is primitive. The compass, the astrolabe, and the rudimentary nautical charts are the best available, but they are laughably inadequate for the task at hand. The world is much bigger than any of them know, and yet they go. The sails are raised, the ropes are taut, and the 3 ships slip away from the familiar coastline. For the first few weeks, the journey is relatively uneventful. They make a stop at the Canary Islands, a Spanish possession, for a final resupply and to repair the Pinta's rudder. Columbus, ever the optimist, is making a point of recording his daily progress and his every observation in a logbook. This log, a mainstream historical fact, will become one of the most important documents in history, a window into his thoughts and a record of the voyage that changed everything. But soon, The familiar sight of land vanishes, replaced by the endless expanse of the deep blue Atlantic. You're now on the ocean with them, feeling the sway of the deck, the constant hum of the wind in the sails, and the slow creep of anxiety among the crew. Day after day the sun rises and sets over the same monotonous horizon. The days turn into weeks, and the crew's mood sours. They start to grumble. They are scared. There is no one to talk to, no one to reassure them. They are in a truly unknowable world. The only thing that keeps them going is Columbus's sheer force of will, his unshakable belief that they will reach Asia. But his faith is not enough to quell their mounting terror. The men on board the ships are not just worried about the distance. There are the persistent folktales of sea monsters and other dangers, and as the days stretch on you can feel the pressure building. They begin to see strange signs, a floating branch, a flight of birds. These are false alarms, but they are enough to raise and then dash the hopes of the desperate men. The crew becomes mutinous. They demand that Columbus turn back, but he refuses. He lies to them about the true distance they have travelled, a mainstream historical fact that shows his ruthless and calculating nature. He keeps a secret, shorter log for his men and a much longer, more accurate one for himself. It's a pragmatic lie, a necessary deceit to keep them from panicking and throwing him overboard. Historians still argue whether Columbus was a truly brilliant mariner or simply an incredibly lucky one. He was, to be sure, an exceptional navigator for his time, but his entire premise was based on a flawed calculation. Without the Americas in his way, his expedition would have been a disaster of epic proportions. Was his success a testament to his skill or a fortunate accident? The truth is, the two aren't mutually exclusive. His brilliance got him the funding and the ships, and his tenacity got him across the ocean. The existence of the Americas in his path was the lucky break that turned his folly into a world-changing event. And then, on the night of October 11th, a sailor on the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana spots something on the horizon. "Tierra! Tierra!" he screams. "Land!" The men rush to the rail, staring into the dark. It's an electrifying moment. The long agonizing wait is over. The impossible has happened. The next morning, October 12th, 1492, they land on a small island in the Bahamas. Columbus, believing he has reached the East Indies, names it San Salvador. He plants the banner of Castile and takes possession of the island in the name of his sovereigns, Isabella and Ferdinand. You're a witness to the beginning of the Columbian Exchange, a term that will later be used to describe the vast transfer of plants, animals, culture, and disease between the Old World and the New World. The sheer relief and joy of the crew are palpable. They have survived. They have reached land. They believe they are on the cusp of an unimaginable fortune in gold and spices. But you, with your knowledge of the future, can't help but feel a profound sense of sadness. The moment of discovery, the moment of triumph, is also the beginning of an era of conquest, exploitation, and unimaginable suffering for the people who already live there. The world is about to change forever, and not always for the better. The consequences of this one voyage, a gamble by a pious queen on a desperate man, will echo through the centuries, creating empires and destroying entire civilizations. You've witnessed the perilous journey, the mutiny averted by a whisper of land, and now you stand with Christopher Columbus on the shore of a small island he has just named San Salvador. The year is 1492, and the world is about to change forever. The air is warm and humid, and the strange tropical foliage is unlike anything you've ever seen. But your attention is immediately drawn to the people. They are a sight to behold. The indigenous inhabitants of the island, the Taino, are people of the Arawak language family. They are naked, with smooth brown skin, and their bodies are adorned with paint. They look at the strange bearded men in their heavy clothes with a mixture of curiosity and awe. Columbus, believing he is on the outskirts of Asia, is utterly convinced that these people are the Indians he was seeking. He writes in his logbook, a mainstream historical fact, that they are well built, with very handsome bodies, and that they would make fine servants. This simple, terrible observation is a gut punch. It reveals the true mindset of the European newcomers, who see these people not as equals but as potential subjects, labourers, and souls to be saved. The encounter is, for a moment, peaceful. The Taino, who have never seen anything like the ships, the compasses, or the heavy iron swords of the Europeans, are fascinated. They trade with the newcomers, offering cotton, parrots, and small trinkets for glass beads, bells, and other European curiosities. This initial exchange, a seemingly innocent moment of curiosity, is the first act of a long and tragic play. Columbus, for his part, is on a single-minded quest for gold. He asks every person he meets where the gold is. The Taino, who have very little, point him in the direction of other islands, and he and his men set off, island hopping through the Bahamas. They are a force of pure, destructive momentum. They are not here to live in harmony with nature or to appreciate a new culture. They are here to find wealth and to claim it for their queen. Columbus continues to write in his log, marvelling at the beauty of the islands and the generosity of the people, but always returning to his singular obsession. He notes that the Taino are very simple and innocent, and that with 50 men he could subject them all and make them do all that one wished. It's a chilling thought, a premonition of the brutality to come. And this leads us to a crucial point that historians still argue about. Was Columbus's treatment of the indigenous peoples a personal failing, or was it a product of the time and the culture he came from? There is no doubt that his actions were monstrous. He captured and enslaved many of the Taino, forced them to search for gold, and subjected them to brutal punishments if they failed. But he was also a product of a world where conquest and slavery were the norm. He was doing what he believed a conqueror was supposed to do. He saw himself as a servant of God and a servant of his queen, bringing what he saw as the light of Christianity to a world of darkness. It's a convenient self-justification, a way to absolve himself of the terrible things he was doing. One quirky tidbit you might find interesting is the first gift of the New World to the Old World: tobacco. Columbus's men encountered the Taino smoking what they called tobaccos, dried leaves rolled up and set alight. They were offered the smoke and were initially confused by it, but the habit quickly caught on. Columbus himself, however, didn't seem to be a fan. He recorded the practice but didn't seem to take it up. This small, seemingly insignificant detail is a harbinger of the massive cultural and biological exchange that is about to happen. The journey continues to Cuba and then to Hispaniola, which Columbus names La Isla Española, or the Spanish island. It is here, on Christmas Eve, that the Santa Maria runs aground and is destroyed. It is an act of pure, dumb luck. The shipwreck forces Columbus to leave a group of his men behind. He builds a small fort, La Navidad, out of the ship's timbers and leaves 39 men there, promising to return with more ships and supplies. It is a moment of desperation that turns into an act of founding, a forced start to a new colony. He leaves strict instructions for his men to treat the natives well and to search for gold. But he knows, and you know, that these instructions will be ignored. Columbus and his remaining crew, now packed onto the much smaller Niña and Pinta, begin their journey back to Spain in January 1493. The return trip is a nightmare. They're hit by a series of brutal storms, and the tiny ships are tossed and turned like corks. The men, who had so recently tasted success, now face the very real prospect of being swallowed by the sea. Columbus is so convinced they will not survive that he writes a summary of his findings, seals it in a barrel and tosses it overboard, hoping that it will somehow wash ashore. It's a gesture of faith, a final act of a desperate man to ensure his legacy will not be lost. But they do survive. In March 1493, after a long and harrowing journey, Columbus's 2 ships limp into the port of Palos. The news of his discovery spreads like wildfire. The town erupts in celebration. He is a hero, a modern-day Marco Polo who has found a new route to the riches of the East. You watch him as he makes his way to Barcelona to meet with Isabella and Ferdinand. He brings with him his proof, a handful of gold, some strange plants, a few exotic parrots, and a small group of Taino natives he has enslaved to present to the Queen. The court of Isabella and Ferdinand is stunned. The Queen, who gambled on this crazy man, is vindicated. She and her husband receive him with all the pomp and circumstance due to a conquering hero. He's granted a new coat of arms, and his promises of wealth and glory seem to be on the verge of fulfillment. They have, in their minds, been chosen by God to lead a new era of global conquest and religious expansion. But you know that the true implications of this discovery are far more complex and far more tragic. The collision of these two worlds will not be a harmonious merging of cultures. It will be a violent and destructive process, and its seeds have just been sown. You've witnessed the triumph of the Catholic monarchs, the conquest of Granada, and the return of Columbus, hailed as a hero. Now you are about to witness another defining moment of 1492, a moment that will forever stain Isabella's legacy. This isn't a story of conquest or exploration. It's a story of forced exile, of a community torn from its roots. The stage for this is set in the same city where Columbus was received as a hero, Barcelona. It's here, in the spring of 1492, that the Catholic monarchs make a terrible decision. For centuries, Spain, or what we would now call Spain, had been a unique place in Europe. Jews, Christians and Muslims had coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. The Jewish community in particular was vibrant and influential. They were bankers, doctors, scholars and royal advisors. But in the late 14th century, a wave of anti-Jewish riots swept across Spain, forcing many Jews to convert to Christianity. These were the conversos you heard about earlier. But as the number of conversos grew, so too did the suspicion and resentment from the old Christians. And, as you saw, the Spanish Inquisition was born to deal with this problem of false converts. Now, with the last Muslim kingdom conquered and the sense of a unified Christian Spain at its peak, Isabella and Ferdinand turn their attention to the remaining Jewish population. They have a problem. As long as there are practicing Jews in their kingdom, the conversos are tempted to return to their old faith. The Inquisition argues that the solution is simple: remove the temptation entirely. The Inquisitor General, Tomás de Torquemada, argues forcefully for the expulsion. He's a man of singular purpose and unbending conviction. He sees the Jews as a corrupting influence, a source of heresy, and a permanent threat to the spiritual purity of his kingdom. And so, on March 31st, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand sign the Alhambra Decree, a mainstream historical fact that orders the expulsion of all Jews from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. The decree gives the Jews a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or leave the country within 4 months. They are allowed to take their property with them, but they are forbidden from taking gold, silver or other precious metals. It's a cruel twist, a way to ensure that they are stripped of their wealth as they flee. You can feel the shock and despair that ripples through the Jewish communities of Spain. For centuries this had been their home. Their ancestors had lived here for over 1,000 years. They were Spanish as much as anyone else was. The edict shatters their world. They have to decide in a matter of months whether to renounce their faith and their heritage or to leave everything they have ever known behind. You watch as families are torn apart, as neighbours who have lived side by side for generations suddenly look at each other with suspicion and fear. The numbers are staggering. The estimates vary, but it's believed that between 100,000 and 160,000 Jews were forced into exile. They flee to Portugal, to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire and to other parts of Europe. Many of them die along the way from starvation, disease or pirate attacks. It's an exodus of biblical proportions, a diaspora known as the expulsion of 1492. Historians still argue whether this was a shrewd political move or a purely religious one. Was it an act of genuine religious piety, a sincere belief that a pure Christian kingdom was a better kingdom? Or was it a cynical, calculated move to appease the Inquisition, to eliminate a potential source of dissent and to seize the wealth of a minority population? The answer, as is often the case with Isabella, is a complex mix of both. She saw no contradiction between her faith and her actions. In her mind, she was saving souls by forcing them to choose Christianity, and purifying her kingdom by removing those who refused. She was a pious queen who saw her every action as a means to a divine end. And here's a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of sadness to the story. A prominent Jewish figure, Isaac Abravanel, who was a financier and a royal advisor, reportedly offered Isabella a vast sum of money, 300,000 ducats, to revoke the edict. It was a king's ransom, a fortune that could have funded many more voyages like Columbus's. But Isabella, according to a contemporary account, turned him down. Her hand stayed by the Inquisitor General, Torquemada, who reportedly threw a crucifix on the table and demanded, "Judas sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. You would sell him for 30,000 pieces of gold?" The story may be apocryphal, but it speaks to the deep, unshakable hold that religious zealotry had on the court and on the queen. The expulsion of 1492 is one of the darkest chapters in Spanish history. It represents the triumph of religious purity over economic and social stability. Spain lost a vibrant, intelligent and productive segment of its population. The decision would have long-lasting economic and cultural consequences, and would forever brand Isabella in the eyes of many as a religious fanatic, a bigot and a tyrant. It's a terrible, irreversible moment, and you feel the weight of its injustice as you watch the long, sorrowful procession of exiles make their way to the coast, leaving their homes behind forever. The unified Spain that Isabella so desperately wanted is now a reality, but it has been purchased at a terrible price. You've witnessed the terrible edict that forced the Jewish people into exile. But for those who stayed, for those who converted, the nightmare is only just beginning. The focus of the Spanish Inquisition now shifts to the very community it was supposedly created to protect, the conversos. These are the people who chose to remain in their homeland, who chose to become Catholic, often with the sincere hope of living a new life in peace. But you will soon see that peace is not an option for them. The Inquisition, under the iron fist of Tomás de Torquemada, does not trust these converts. They believe that even if they profess Catholicism, they are secretly practicing their old faith in private. The expulsion of the Jews, a mainstream historical fact, was supposed to eliminate the bad influence on the conversos, but the Inquisition now argues that the bad influence is internal. The Inquisitors are given a new, more sinister mandate to find the Judaizers among the converts, to root out the secret heretics, and to purify the body of the Church. You now find yourself in the heart of this terrifying new reality. The Inquisitors have a list of new signs to look for. Does a converso avoid eating pork? A sign of a Judaizer? Do they light candles on Friday night? A sign of a Judaizer. Do they refuse to work on Saturday? A sign of a Judaizer. You can almost feel the paranoia spreading through the cities. Neighbours, servants, and even family members are encouraged to denounce one another. The Inquisition sets up a period of grace, a time when people can confess their heresy and receive a lighter punishment. But this is a trap. The confessions are then used to implicate others. The auto da fe, the public acts of faith, become more frequent and more elaborate. You stand in the crowd watching a procession of the condemned. They wear the San Benito, a special penitential garment with a large cross on the front, often with flames or demons painted on it to signify the nature of their heresy. The condemned are paraded through the streets for all to see, a public shaming that is meant to serve as a warning. At the end of the procession, they are sentenced. Some are sent to prison, their property is confiscated, and their children are barred from holding public office. Others are relaxed to the secular arm, which is the Inquisition's polite way of saying they are handed over to the state for execution. The usual method of execution is to be burned at the stake. This is where you see the true cruelty of the institution. The accused is not allowed to confront his accusers. The evidence against him is often based on the testimony of a handful of anonymous witnesses. The inquisitors are judge, jury, and, often, executioner. The process is a total mockery of justice. There's a quirky tidbit about this that highlights the psychological cruelty of the Inquisition. The trials were often conducted in secret, and the accused were held in isolation for months or even years. This mental torment was often enough to break a man's will and force a confession, even if they were innocent. The Inquisition understood that fear was its most powerful tool, but historians still argue whether the scale of the persecution was as widespread and systematic as it has been portrayed. The numbers of those who were burned at the stake have been the subject of intense scholarly debate. While earlier historians estimated tens of thousands of deaths, modern scholars, using a more careful analysis of the surviving records, have put the number of deaths at number of executions closer to 2,000 for the entire reign of Isabella and Ferdinand. This is not to diminish the horror of the Inquisition, of course. 2,000 executions is still a horrific number, but it does raise questions about the historical narrative. Was the Inquisition a machine of mass murder or a tool of social control that used the threat of violence to enforce religious conformity? For Isabella, the Inquisition was a necessary evil, a divine instrument to purify her kingdom. She genuinely believed that she was saving souls from damnation. The fact that the crown profited immensely from the confiscation of property from the condemned was, in her mind, simply a side benefit. She saw herself as a pious queen, a ruler who was responsible for the spiritual well-being of her people. She was willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure that her kingdom was a Catholic one. pure and undefiled. The expulsion of the Jews and the persecution of the conversos had a devastating effect on the Spanish economy and society. The Jewish community was a vital part of Spain's intellectual and economic life. Their loss was a major blow, and their absence would be felt for centuries. You can see the effects. The once vibrant centres of Jewish scholarship are now empty. The great Jewish doctors, scholars and merchants are gone. The Spanish people are poorer, less diverse, and more paranoid than they were before. The Inquisition, you now understand, is not a separate historical event. It is a direct and logical extension of Isabella's worldview. She was a pious queen who saw her every action as a means to a divine end. She was willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure that her kingdom was a Catholic one, pure and undefiled. She saw no contradiction between her piety and the brutality of the institution she supported. In her mind, she was saving souls, even if it meant destroying bodies. The Inquisition is the dark side of her project of unification, a shadow that will fall over the entire nation and stain her legacy for centuries to come. The war is over, the kingdom is united, but now a new, more insidious battle is being waged, and this one is for the hearts and minds of her people, and you can't help but feel a chill. You've now seen the full, terrifying scope of Isabella's reign. A pious queen who, in a single year, conquered the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, sponsored a voyage that would change the world, and expelled the Jewish people from her lands. It's a series of events so monumental and so contradictory that you have to ask yourself why. What drives a monarch to be both a patron of science and a force of religious persecution? The answer, as you're starting to understand, lies in the deep, complex and often chilling relationship between Isabella's personal piety and her ruthless political agenda. She was not a modern ruler, she was a medieval queen with an unshakable faith. A mainstream historical fact you need to grasp is that for Isabella, her reign was not a secular affair. It was a divine trust. She genuinely believed that she was chosen by God to rule, and that her primary responsibility was not just to manage her kingdom, but to ensure the spiritual well-being of her subjects. Her every political decision, from the conquest of Granada to the establishment of the Inquisition, was framed as a religious act, a way to please God and to save souls. She saw herself as a new Queen Esther, a biblical figure who saved her people from persecution, and her kingdom as a new Israel, a holy land that had to be purified of all heresy and infidelity. This deep piety, which you first glimpsed in the quiet solitude of Arevalo, now becomes the engine of state policy. Her daily life is a testament to this devotion. She attends Mass daily, fasts regularly, and surrounds herself with devout religious advisors, most notably her confessor, Hernando de Talavera, and later the fearsome Tomas de Torquemada. She's known to have spent hours in prayer and to have a deep personal relationship with her faith. This is not a political act. This is who she is. She is a true believer, and that belief makes her both incredibly strong and incredibly dangerous. But historians still argue about the exact weight of these motivations. Was her piety the true engine, or was it a convenient cover for what were, in fact, cold, calculating political decisions? It's a valid question. The expulsion of the Jews, for example, did more than just cleanse the kingdom of a religious minority. It also allowed the crown to confiscate the property of those who were caught trying to smuggle out gold and silver. The Inquisition, while a religious institution, was also a powerful tool for centralising power, as it answered directly to the crown, bypassing the authority of the nobles and the local bishops. Isabella's support for the New World voyages, while framed as a way to convert new souls, was also a quest for new wealth and a way to bypass the trade monopoly of Portugal and Venice. The truth is, for Isabella, the two were not separate. Her political agenda was her religious agenda. She saw no contradiction between seizing the wealth of heretics and funding a war, or between sending missionaries to the New World and enslaving the inhabitants. It was all part of a single, unified, and divinely sanctioned project. She was building a new Spain, a unified nation that was powerful, prosperous, and most importantly Catholic. The end, in her mind, justified the means, and a quirky tidbit that illustrates this blend of piety and pragmatism is the creation of the royal monogram. The intertwined letters Y and F for Isabel, an old spelling of Isabella, and Fernando, along with the yoked eagle of Saint, John the Evangelist were a visual representation of their shared power and their divine mission. The motto, tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, was not just a political slogan, it was a statement of their spiritual partnership, a public declaration that they were equal partners in a holy mission to rule their kingdoms in God's name. Isabella's reign, you now understand, is a complex tapestry of piety and power. She reformed the Castilian government, created a professional army, sponsored a voyage that would change the world, and unified a nation that had been a collection of warring kingdoms for centuries. She was a brilliant and effective ruler. But she also presided over the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews, and she gave her blessing to a system of colonial exploitation that would result in the deaths of millions. She's a figure of profound contradictions, and her legacy is a testament to the idea that great good and terrible evil can be born of the very same convictions. You can't help but feel a sense of unease as you reflect on her reign. She was not a monster in the way that some historical figures are portrayed. She was a woman of deep faith and unshakable conviction. She believed she was doing God's work, and in that belief, she was capable of both incredible acts of courage and terrifying acts of cruelty. She is in a way the perfect embodiment of her time, a ruler who bridged the medieval world and the modern world, and who, in the process, created a nation that was at once a beacon of civilization and an instrument of terror. The stage is now set for the next chapter of her story, a chapter that will be written in the distant, newly discovered lands of the Americas. You've seen the grand voyage and the first fateful encounter. Now let's go back across the ocean, not on a tiny caravel, but in a flood of ships and settlers. The news of Columbus's discovery has sent a shockwave through Europe, and Isabella and Ferdinand are ready to capitalise on their gamble. This is not a slow process. It is a full-scale, government-backed enterprise. The second voyage of Columbus in 1493, a mainstream historical fact, is a testament to this. It is a massive expedition of 17 ships and over 1,200 men, not just sailors, but soldiers, priests, and administrators. The goal is no longer just exploration, it is colonization. You are now a silent witness to the beginning of a new, complex, and often horrific chapter in Isabella's story. The Spanish settlers, under the leadership of Columbus, established the first permanent European settlement in the Americas, La Isabela, on the island of Hispaniola. But things quickly fall apart. The dream of a tropical paradise with rivers of gold turns into a nightmare of disease, starvation, and a bloody clash of cultures. The Spanish, who came expecting to be served, are not interested in manual labour. They demand gold, and they demand it now. When the Taino people, who have very little, cannot provide it, the Spanish resort to brutal force. Isabella, back in Spain, is far removed from the day-to-day horrors of the New World. But she is the one who sets the tone. She's a pious queen, and she genuinely believes in the missionary purpose of the colonial enterprise. She has ordered that the indigenous peoples be treated with humanity and respect, and be converted to Catholicism. She sees them as new souls for God, not as chattel. And here's where you see the profound contradiction of her reign. She wants to expand her empire to enrich her kingdom and to convert the heathens, but she doesn't seem to grasp that the very men she is sent to do her bidding are driven by greed, not piety. Historians still argue whether Isabella was genuinely ignorant of the atrocities being committed in her name, or if she simply chose to look the other way. The truth is, reports of the abuse of the indigenous peoples did reach her court. Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest who would later become a staunch critic of the colonial system, was one of the first to document the horrors. He wrote in vivid detail of the atrocities being committed against the Taino. Isabella, to her credit, was deeply troubled by these reports. In 1500 she issued a royal decree forbidding the enslavement of the natives, stating that they were her subjects and were to be treated as such. It's a remarkable act, a quirky tidbit that sets her apart from other monarchs of her time. She even had some of Columbus's men who had enslaved natives sent back to Spain in chains to be punished. But her decrees were often ignored. The distance between Spain and the Americas was immense, and the men on the ground, hungry for gold and power, did as they pleased. The systems of forced labour she tried to regulate, such as the encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to demand labour and tribute from a certain number of indigenous people, were ripe for abuse. Isabella, in her attempts to impose order from afar, was creating a system that was fundamentally flawed and would lead to the destruction of entire populations. The great irony is that Isabella's piety, the very thing that made her want to save the souls of the indigenous peoples, was also the justification for their subjugation. The missionaries who came to the New World were there to convert them, to save them from what they saw as a life of ignorance and sin, and if the natives resisted conversion, if they refused to work, if they rebelled against the new Spanish order, it was, in the eyes of the settlers and many of the friars, because they were barbaric and uncivilized, and therefore deserved to be conquered and ruled. The spiritual mission and the colonial agenda became inextricably linked, a dangerous combination that allowed for the dehumanization of the native populations. The population of the Taino, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands at the time of Columbus's arrival, was decimated by disease, starvation, and overwork. Within a generation, their culture and way of life were all but destroyed. This is a profound and terrible part of Isabella's legacy. She was a queen who wanted to save souls, but the men she sent in her name ended up killing millions. She was a ruler who wanted to create a just and humane empire, but her actions laid the groundwork for a system of exploitation that would endure for centuries. You now understand that the story of Isabella is not a simple morality play. She's not a hero or villain, but a complex human being, a product of her time, who was capable of both great piety and terrible cruelty. Her legacy in the Americas is a testament to this complexity. She wanted to expand her faith, but she ended up destroying a civilization. She wanted to create a new empire, but she created a system that was built on blood and suffering. The discovery of the New World, the great triumph of her reign, would also become its greatest tragedy, a dark shadow that would follow her legacy for centuries to come. You've witnessed the conquests, the edicts, and the transatlantic voyages. Now, you can step back and see the full picture of Isabella's reign, not as a series of isolated events, but as a single, monumental project of nation-building. By the time of her death, the kingdom she inherited was almost unrecognizable. It was a kingdom transformed, and the changes she wrought, for better or worse, would endure for centuries. A mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that Isabella's greatest legacy was the unification and centralization of power in Spain. When she came to the throne, Castile was a fractured kingdom, dominated by a handful of powerful, often rebellious nobles. Her father had been a weak king, unable to control his own court. Isabella, with Ferdinand at her side, was the exact opposite. She systematically dismantled the power of the old aristocracy, not by outright war, but by a series of clever legal and political manoeuvres. She established the Santa Hermandad, which you saw, a kind of national police force that enforced the king's law in every corner of the kingdom, a direct challenge to the power of the feudal lords. She reformed the royal council, filling it with educated lawyers and bureaucrats from the middle class, men who were loyal to her, not to the old noble families. She even created a new kind of army, a professional force that was paid by the crown, not by the nobles, ensuring that her military power was her own. This centralization of power was crucial. It meant that Spain could, for the first time, act as a single, unified entity on the world stage. It was no longer a collection of squabbling kingdoms, but a single, powerful nation. This newfound strength was what allowed Spain to take on a project as audacious as the conquest of Granada and the voyages of Columbus. Without Isabella's reforms, none of it would have been possible, and a quirky tidbit that illustrates her grasp of these reforms is her personal involvement in the judicial system. Isabella was known to personally hear petitions from her subjects, often sitting outside a church or in a public square to listen to their grievances. She was a hands-on monarch who saw herself as the ultimate arbiter of justice. She would often travel to different parts of the kingdom, holding court and issuing verdicts. This wasn't just a PR stunt, it was a way to bypass the local courts, which were often corrupt or controlled by the local nobles. It was a powerful message to her people that she, the queen, was their ultimate protection against injustice. But historians still argue whether her centralization of power was a positive development. While it brought order and stability to a fractured kingdom, it also laid the groundwork for the highly centralized and later authoritarian Spanish state. Her reforms crushed local autonomy and dissent, and created a system that was dependent on the absolute power of the monarch. Was she a benevolent ruler who brought order to a chaotic world, or was she a ruthless autocrat who crushed all opposition in the name of a unified kingdom? The answer, as you can probably guess, is somewhere in the middle. She was both a reformer and a tyrant, a queen who believed that the end of a unified, powerful and pious Spain justified any means. The legacy of Isabella is also one of profound cultural change. The expulsion of the Jews and the persecution of the conversos stripped Spain of a vibrant and intelligent part of its population. The country became less diverse, less tolerant, and more insular. The emphasis on religious purity and orthodoxy, which you saw in the Spanish Inquisition, led to a stifling intellectual climate. The great universities of Spain, which had once been centres of intellectual exchange between different faiths, began to decline. The focus on religious conformity meant that new ideas, especially from the Protestant Reformation that was just starting to take shape in Europe, were viewed with suspicion and ruthlessly suppressed. The discovery of the New World, the great triumph of her reign, would also lead to its greatest challenges. The flow of gold and silver from the Americas would make Spain the richest and most powerful nation in Europe, but it would also lead to crippling inflation and a neglect of domestic industries. The Spanish would become dependent on the wealth from their colonies, a dependency that would ultimately lead to their decline. The empire she helped build would be both a source of immense power and a millstone around the neck of her descendants. As you look back at her reign, you can't help but be struck by the scale of her ambition. She was not content to simply rule her kingdom. She wanted to transform it, to remake it in her own image, and in many ways she succeeded. She created a new Spain, a nation that was unified, powerful, and proudly Catholic. But that nation was also born of intolerance, war, and persecution. She's a figure of profound contradictions, a woman who was both a saint and a tyrant, a patron of explorers and a persecutor of her own people. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that great good and terrible evil can be born of the very same convictions. You have now seen the full scope of her reign. But the story isn't over yet. The final act, the story of her last days and her legacy, is still to come. The kingdom she created, the nation she transformed, will now have to contend with the consequences of her choices, and you, our silent observer, will be there to see it all. You've seen Isabella at the height of her power, a queen who transformed her kingdom and set it on the path to global empire. But now, you must witness her final act, the slow, inexorable decline of a woman who for so long seemed invincible. It's the early 16th century, and Isabella's life is now shadowed by a series of personal tragedies that would test the strength of anyone, let alone a monarch. The pious and powerful queen, who had so successfully managed the affairs of her kingdom, now finds herself powerless against the whims of fate. The first blow came in 1497, a mainstream historical fact, with the death of her only son, Juan, the heir to the throne. He was a promising young man, and his death was a devastating blow to both Isabella and Ferdinand. You can feel her grief, the raw, visceral pain of a mother who has lost her child. This was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political disaster. The carefully planned succession was now in ruins. The heir to the thrones of Castile and Aragon was now Isabella's eldest daughter, also named Isabella. But the grief wasn't over yet. The Princess Isabella died a year later in childbirth, and her infant son Miguel, the heir to 3 kingdoms, Spain, Portugal and Aragon, died in 1500. You now watch as Isabella's spirit is slowly crushed by these losses. The vibrant, decisive queen you once knew is now a woman in mourning, her face etched with sorrow. Her second daughter, Juana, becomes the new heir. But Juana, known to history as Juana the Mad, is mentally unstable, a deeply troubled woman whose erratic behaviour and mental illness would cast a dark shadow over the future of the Spanish monarchy. Isabella, in her last days, must now contend with the terrible knowledge that her life's work, the grand project of unification, could be undone by the instability of her own child. And here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the depths of Isabella's grief. In her final years, she was often seen wearing a simple brown habit, the garb of the Franciscan order, as a sign of her piety and her acceptance of God's will, even in her sorrow. The queen who once wore the most opulent clothes in Europe now dressed in the simple garments of a humble penitent. It's a powerful image, a testament to the fact that for all her power, she was still just a woman, a mother and a devout Catholic who was trying to make sense of her profound loss. Isabella's health begins to fail. She suffers from a mysterious illness, possibly a form of dropsy, and her body is racked with pain. As she lies on her deathbed, you can feel the quiet solemnity of the moment. The great queen, who was once the centre of her world, is now a frail woman, her mind still sharp but her body giving way. She knows her time is short and she turns her attention to her final, most important act, her last will and testament. This document, a mainstream historical fact, is a window into her mind, a final attempt to secure her legacy and ensure the survival of her kingdom. In her will, she formally names Juana as the heir to the throne of Castile, but she also names Ferdinand as the governor and administrator of the kingdom, in the case that Juana is unable to rule, a clear sign of her deep concern for her daughter's mental state. This provision would lead to a bitter power struggle after her death. She also leaves a series of instructions for her descendants, urging them to continue the war against the infidels in Granada, and to ensure the proper treatment of the indigenous peoples in the Americas, urging her heirs to protect them from the abuses of the settlers. It's a final, powerful contradiction. The queen who sanctioned the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews is also the queen who, on her deathbed, demanded that the native peoples of the New World be treated with humanity and respect. Historians still argue whether this final testament was an act of genuine repentance, or simply a final act of political pragmatism. Was she, in her last moments, trying to atone for the cruelties of her reign? Or was she simply trying to secure the future of her kingdom by providing a clear line of succession and a set of instructions for her heirs? The truth, as you've come to expect, is a mixture of both. She was a pious woman who saw no contradiction between her faith and her actions. She believed in her divine right to rule, and she believed that she was doing God's work. Her will is a testament to that unshakable faith and to her unwavering commitment to the kingdom she built. On November 26th, 1504, in the castle of Medina del Campo, Isabella I of Castile dies. Her death marks the end of an era. The kingdom she so carefully built is now in the hands of her unstable daughter and her politically shrewd but now estranged husband, Ferdinand. Her body, after a long procession, is finally laid to rest in the Royal Chapel of Granada, a symbolic final resting place in the city she so ardently conquered. You're now at the end of her story. You've seen her rise from a quiet princess to a powerful queen. You've seen her create a nation, sponsor a voyage that changed the world, and unleash an institution of terror. She's a figure of profound contradictions, a woman who was both a saint and a tyrant, a patron of explorers and a persecutor of her own people. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that great good and terrible evil can be born of the very same convictions. The stage is now set for the next chapter of her story, a chapter that will be written in the distant, newly discovered lands of the Americas. You've stood at the edge of Isabella's grave, a witness to her final moments and her last wishes. But a story, particularly a story as complex as hers, doesn't end with death. It's here, in the centuries after her passing, that you get to see how she's remembered, debated, and re-evaluated. The Isabella who was a saint to some and a tyrant to others has become a figure of profound scholarly debate. The truth, as you've come to expect, is not a single, simple answer. Historians still argue about her legacy. Some see her as a visionary, a nation-builder who brought order out of chaos and set Spain on the path to global power. They point to her administrative reforms, a mainstream historical fact that centralised power, created a national army, and brought a kind of justice to a fractured kingdom. They argue that she was a product of her time, a medieval monarch who, in a deeply religious age, was simply doing what she believed was her divine duty. In this view, she is a courageous and brilliant ruler who was able to overcome immense odds, to secure her throne and create a lasting legacy. She is in this narrative a hero. But others paint a far darker picture. They see her as a religious fanatic, a bigot, and a tyrant who used the state to enforce her own narrow vision of religious purity. They point to the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews, two of the most infamous events of her reign, as evidence of her cruelty and intolerance. They argue that her piety was nothing more than a convenient justification for a ruthless political agenda that enriched her kingdom at the expense of a minority population. In this view, she is not a hero, but a monster, a figure whose reign laid the groundwork for centuries of intolerance and persecution. And then there are the colonial historians, who add another layer of complexity to the debate. They see her as a key figure in the rise of a system of colonial exploitation that would result in the deaths of millions of indigenous people. While they acknowledge that she was not personally present for the atrocities, they argue that she created the very system that made those atrocities possible. They point to her initial decrees about the treatment of the indigenous people, and argue that they were a form of benevolent paternalism, a way of justifying their subjugation and forced conversion to Catholicism. In this view, she is a key figure in the rise of European colonialism, a woman whose piety and good intentions were no match for the greed and brutality of the men she sent in her name. And a quirky tidbit about this debate is the ongoing push for her canonization. The Catholic Church has been considering Isabella for sainthood for centuries, a process that has been stalled by the very controversies you've seen. Her supporters, and there are many, point to her deep personal piety, her defence of the faith, and her role in bringing new souls to Catholicism. They see her as a model of a virtuous Catholic monarch, but her opponents, including many Jewish and indigenous groups, point to her role in the Inquisition and the expulsion, and argue that a woman who presided over such a reign of terror cannot be considered a saint. The debate over her sainthood is, in a way, a microcosm of the larger debate over her legacy, a final, unresolvable argument over whether she was a saintly monarch or a genocidal fanatic. So, where does that leave you, our silent observer? The scholarly debate is far from settled. Was she a saintly Catholic monarch or a genocidal fanatic? The truth, as is often the case in history, is that she was both. She was a woman of immense piety, a ruler who believed in her divine mission, and who was capable of great courage and vision. But she was also a woman of her time, a ruler who saw no contradiction between her faith and the terrible violence she sanctioned in its name. She was, in a way, the perfect embodiment of her era, a bridge between the medieval and the modern world, a queen who was at once a hero and a villain. As you look back at her reign, you can't help but be struck by the scale of her ambition. She was not content to simply rule her kingdom, she wanted to transform it, to remake it in her own image, and in many ways she succeeded. She created a new Spain, a nation that was unified, powerful, and proudly Catholic. But that nation was also born of intolerance, war, and persecution. She is a figure of profound contradictions, a woman who was both a saint and a tyrant, a patron of explorers and a persecutor of her own people. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that great good and terrible evil can be born of the very same convictions. You have now seen the full scope of her reign, but the story isn't over yet. The final act, the story of her last days and her legacy, is still to come. The kingdom she created, the nation she transformed, will now have to contend with the consequences of her choices, and you, our silent observer, will be there to see it all. You've explored the monumental public legacy of Isabella, a queen who transformed her kingdom. But now you get to see the quieter, more tragic side of her life's work, the fates of her children, a family saga that would be a cautionary tale for any monarch. For all her political savvy and strategic brilliance, Isabella could not control the lives of her offspring, and their destinies would prove to be a tangled web of triumph and profound heartbreak. The future of the unified Spanish kingdom, the very project she had dedicated her life to, would rest on the shoulders of a family cursed by illness and misfortune. Let's start with her oldest daughter, Isabella. She was married to Afonso, the heir to the Portuguese throne, a union that was meant to cement a lasting peace with their rival neighbour. But Afonso died shortly after their marriage, leaving Isabella a widow at a young age. A mainstream historical fact is that she was then remarried to Afonso's uncle, Manuel I, King of Portugal, a politically expedient but deeply personal tragedy. She died in childbirth, just like her younger sister, and her death left her young son, Miguel, as the heir to 3 kingdoms, Castile, Aragon and Portugal. It was a fleeting, magnificent moment of potential unification, a grand dream that would be shattered by the boy's death at the age of 2. Then there was Juan, the only son, the much-awaited heir. His life and death are particularly poignant. Isabella and Ferdinand doted on him, as he was the future of their dynasty. He was betrothed to Margaret of Austria, a strategic marriage to forge an alliance with the powerful Habsburg family. But he was a frail, sickly young man, and he died of a fever just 6 months after his wedding. The death of her only son was, as you know, a devastating blow to Isabella, a personal tragedy that she never truly recovered from. It was a quirky tidbit of fate that the very child she had relied on to continue her dynasty would be the one to fail her, and in his death he would set the stage for a new, uncertain future. And then there is Juana the Mad. She was at one point the most powerful woman in Europe. She was married to Philip the Handsome, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, another brilliant strategic marriage that would eventually place the Habsburg dynasty on the Spanish throne. But Juana was a deeply troubled woman, prone to fits of jealousy and manic episodes. The death of her brother Juan and her eventual inheritance of the throne seemed to tip her over the edge. Her husband Philip, seeing her mental instability as an opportunity to seize power, had her declared insane, and she was locked away for the rest of her life. Isabella in her last will had seen this coming, and she had tried to provide for it, but she could not stop the tragic descent of her daughter. The fate of Juana's son, Charles, is a mainstream historical fact that would change the course of European history. He was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, and the son of Juana and Philip the Handsome. When his father died, and his mother was deemed unable to rule, he inherited a vast empire that stretched from Spain to the Netherlands to the newly discovered lands of the Americas. He would become Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who would preside over an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. Isabella's children may have been tragic figures, but through her grandson, her dynasty, the House of Trastamara, would merge with the powerful Habsburgs, creating a new, world-spanning empire. Historians still argue whether Juana's madness was a genuine mental illness or a convenient political diagnosis. Was she truly insane, or was she a victim of a patriarchal system that had no place for a powerful woman who was a threat to her husband's power? The records are, as you can imagine, clouded by the biases of the time, but her tragic life and the political turmoil it caused were a direct result of the death of her older siblings. The carefully laid plans of Isabella and Ferdinand had unravelled, and the future of the kingdom was now in the hands of a young man who was not even raised in Spain. And what about her other children? There was Catherine, her youngest daughter, who was married to the English royal family. She was first married to Arthur, the heir to the English throne, and then, after his death, to his brother, the infamous Henry VIII. Her inability to give Henry a male heir led to his break with the Catholic Church, the English Reformation, and the creation of the Church of England. This, too, was a long-term consequence of Isabella's dynastic plans, a ripple effect that she could never have foreseen. So, you see, the private life of Isabella, the story of her family, is as consequential as her public life. Her children's lives and deaths, their marriages and their illnesses, would determine the future of Spain and Europe for centuries to come. The grand project of unification, which you saw her painstakingly create, would be inherited by a series of unlikely and, in some cases, tragic figures. The kingdom she built would survive, but it would be ruled by a new dynasty, a family that would carry her legacy of power, piety and tragedy into the future. The kingdom she created, the nation she transformed, would now have to contend with the consequences of her choices. And you, our silent observer, will be there to see it all. You've witnessed the consolidation of power, the transatlantic voyages, and the tragic fates of her children. Now you can see the ultimate result of Isabella's reign, a global empire built on the foundations of her decisions. This is not a story of conquest alone, but of the far-reaching and often brutal consequences of a queen's ambition. The empire she set in motion would be the first truly global empire, a vast dominion that would forever change the course of human history. The sheer scale of this empire is a mainstream historical fact. By the time of her grandson, Charles V, the Spanish Empire would stretch from the heart of Europe to the vast lands of the Americas and beyond. The wealth that flowed from the New World, particularly the gold and silver from the mines in what is now Mexico and Bolivia, would make Spain the richest and most powerful nation in Europe. This influx of treasure-funded wars, built palaces, and fueled a period of immense artistic and cultural production known as the Spanish Golden Age. You can almost feel the weight of this gold, the immense power it gives to the Spanish crown. But this empire was not built on a foundation of peace. It was built on blood, conquest, and the systematic exploitation of indigenous peoples. The policies that Isabella had put in place, from the initial voyages of Columbus to the establishment of the encomienda system, were the very tools used to subjugate and exploit the native populations. The missionaries, whom she had sent to save souls, were often complicit in the brutalization of the indigenous people. The settlers, whom she had tried to regulate, were often ruthless in their pursuit of wealth and power. The result was a devastating demographic collapse, with entire populations of indigenous people wiped out by disease, overwork, and violence. Historians still argue whether Isabella was genuinely ignorant of the scale of the atrocities being committed in her name, or if she simply chose to look the other way. The truth is, reports of the abuse of the indigenous peoples did reach her court. Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest who had first-hand knowledge of the horrors, wrote in vivid detail of the cruelty. You can almost hear his voice, a lone prophet of doom, warning the queen of the moral stain on her soul. Isabella, to her credit, was deeply troubled by these reports. As you remember, she issued decrees forbidding the enslavement of the natives, and even sent back some of Columbus's men in chains to be punished. But her decrees were often ignored. The distance between Spain and the Americas was immense, and the men on the ground, hungry for gold and power, did as they pleased. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the hypocrisy of the time is the Requerimiento, a document read by Spanish conquistadors to the indigenous peoples before battle. The document, which was written in Spanish, a language the natives didn't understand, explained the history of the world from a Christian perspective, demanded that the natives convert to Catholicism, and warned them that if they resisted they would be enslaved or killed. It was a bizarre, almost comical piece of legalistic justification for a brutal conquest. It was meant to absolve the Spanish of any guilt, to make their violence a matter of legal and moral necessity. It's a chilling reminder that in the hands of the ambitious, even religion and law can become tools of conquest. The empire that Isabella's reign created was a global one, but it was also an empire of profound contradictions. It was an empire that brought Christianity to a new world, but it did so by destroying entire civilizations. It was an empire that created immense wealth, but it did so by building a system of forced labour and human suffering. It was an empire that was born of a queen's piety, but that would be built on a foundation of blood and conquest. The kingdom she so carefully built was now a global power, but it was also a moral minefield. The legacy of Isabella is not a simple one. She was a visionary who united a nation and set it on the path to global power, but she was also a religious fanatic who sanctioned the persecution of her own people, and laid the groundwork for a brutal colonial system. Her reign is a testament to the idea that great good and terrible evil can be born of the very same convictions. She believed she was doing God's work, and in that belief she was capable of both incredible acts of courage and terrifying acts of cruelty. The global empire she created would be the ultimate expression of her complex and contradictory legacy, a world-spanning dominion that would carry her name, her faith, and her moral compromises for centuries to come. The final judgment of her legacy is not a simple one. It is a debate that is still being waged today, a debate over whether she was a saintly monarch or a genocidal fanatic. You've stood in the quiet of a castle in Arevalo, a silent observer to the birth of a princess. You've watched her rise from obscurity to power, a queen who gambled her future on a secretive marriage and a long bloody war. You've seen her preside over the conquest of a kingdom and the expulsion of a people. You've witnessed her support for a voyage that would change the world, and her family's tragic descent into illness and political chaos. Now, as our journey comes to an end, it's time to render a final judgment on Isabella I of Castile. Was she a saintly Catholic monarch, or a genocidal fanatic? The answer, as you've come to understand, is not a simple choice between one or the other. It is in fact a profound and lasting contradiction, a legacy that holds both truths at once. To see her as a saint, you must look at her unshakable faith. A mainstream historical fact is that Isabella's piety was genuine and deeply held. She saw her reign as a divine trust, a mission to purify her kingdom and spread the Catholic faith. She reformed the clergy, patronised religious orders, and in her mind sought to save souls from eternal damnation. She was a woman of prayer and penance, who believed that her every action was in service to God. Her vision of a unified Christian Spain was, for her, a religious imperative, a dream that she would pursue with unwavering determination. This view of her, as a pious and virtuous queen, is the one that her supporters and the Catholic Church have championed for centuries. But to see her as a genocidal fanatic you must look at the terrible consequences of that very same piety. The Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion of the Jews, and the brutal colonial system that was established in her name were all born of her religious zeal. She saw no contradiction between her piety and the violence she sanctioned. In her mind, the end, a unified Catholic kingdom and the salvation of souls, justified the means. The suffering of the conversos, the despair of the exiled Jews, and the decimation of the indigenous peoples of the Americas were all, in a way, collateral damage in her grand project. This view of her as a ruthless and intolerant ruler is the one that her critics have put forth, and it is a view that is supported by the historical record of persecution and death. So, how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposite truths? The answer lies in the profound contradictions of her era. Isabella was a product of her time, a medieval monarch who was also a pioneer of the modern world. She bridged the gap between a feudal, fractured Europe and a new era of powerful, centralized nation-states. She was at once a pious Catholic who believed in her divine mission, and a shrewd, pragmatic politician who understood the importance of power, wealth, and military strength. The scholarly debate over her legacy is not a matter of finding a single truth, but of accepting a complex and messy one. She was a woman of both light and shadow, and her legacy, for better or worse, is a testament to that complexity. A quirky tidbit that perfectly encapsulates this contradiction is her support for the Polyglot Bible, a monumental work of scholarship that was published in Spain in the early 16th century. It was a multi-volume work that included the Old Testament in its original Hebrew and the New Testament in its original Greek, along with the Latin Vulgate and the Aramaic Targum. This was an astonishing act of scholarship for a kingdom that was also actively persecuting Jews and suppressing dissent. It showed a side of Isabella that was a patron of learning and a supporter of intellectual inquiry, even as she was presiding over a regime of religious intolerance. She was a woman who could support the study of Hebrew texts while also expelling the very people who wrote them. So, what is the final judgment? It is not a verdict of guilty or not guilty. It is instead an acknowledgement of a deeply complex historical figure. Isabella I of Castile was a woman of profound faith and unshakable will. She was a visionary who united a nation and set it on the path to global power. But she was also a religious fanatic who sanctioned the persecution of her own people and laid the groundwork for a brutal colonial system. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that great good and terrible evil can be born of the very same convictions. She believed she was doing God's work, and in that belief she was capable of both incredible acts of courage and terrifying acts of cruelty. Her story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the terrible consequences of religious zealotry, but it is also a story of courage, ambition, and the forging of a new world. The kingdom she created, the nation she transformed, would go on to build a global empire that would last for centuries. But that empire would also carry the stain of its beginnings, a legacy of intolerance, conquest, and suffering. Her story is not a simple morality play. It is a profound and lasting contradiction, a legacy that will forever be debated, re-evaluated, and in the end never fully understood. Now, as the whispers of history begin to fade, let's take a moment to ease back into the present. The figures we've met tonight, from the pious queen to the wild-eyed explorer, are now settling back into the quiet of the past. The echoes of their lives, the triumphs and the tragedies, are all around us, but they are no longer a part of our immediate world. The grand drama is over, the curtains have been drawn, and the stage is empty again. It's time to let the images fade, to let the sounds of the Castilian court and the creaking of the ship's timbers become a gentle hum. The weight of history can feel heavy sometimes, but for now you can set it down. Take a deep breath and feel the soft comfort of your pillow beneath your head. The night is quiet and the journey is complete. You can rest now.